Good morning, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for attending today's webinar. Wanted to give you a little bit of insight around the ARPA funding as it relates to local governments and counties. I'm sure you're being inundated with lots of information out there, and we are continuing to analyze the Treasury guidance and provide information out to our clients. This is a significant funding source for local governments, about $65 billion for cities and $65 billion to counties. Today, our panel has some helpful perspectives to share on the things that you ought to be considering when it comes to this federal stimulus funding. We're excited in this partnership that we have with between HDL and eCivis. eCivis has a long track record of providing innovative grants management software and services to cities, counties, some states, and tribes. And they're a great partner of HDL's. We found just a great synergy in working on this grants management and funding opportunity. So Nikki Latini is on our panel today. She's the Vice President of eCivis, and Nikki's been providing cost allocation plan services for clients for over 20 years. And she's recognized as a leader in both indirect cost allocation and total cost of service studies. Also on today's panel is Kimberly Konzak, Strategic Account Executive with HDL. And she's our resident subject matter expert when it comes to maximizing and sustaining federal funding. So with that, I will turn it over to our panel to start their presentation.
Thank you, Andy. So for today's discussion, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. This meeting is being recorded, so I would like to make you aware of that. Also, please put any questions you have in the chat or in the live event Q&A. We want to make sure that we see those questions, and we'll be sure to answer them at the end of the presentation. Also, something to note, there is a 20-second delay with the live event, so just be aware of that as you're typing in answers to questions, typing in questions, just an awareness there. So today we really want to help with the intimidation that the federal funding can bring. It can be overwhelming, especially with some of the large dollar figures that we're seeing for some of you. And so the purpose of this is really to help you learn how to maximize that funding and then sustain it long term. So I thought I would kind of kick it off with a question for all of you, and you'll see in the live event Q&A in the published tab, this question is already out there. How is your agency planning on spending the ARPA funds? So this is just some data. You know, HDL provides sales tax analysis and forecasting services to many of you and hopefully some more of you. So we have this data. And sales tax is number one for most agencies in revenue, but federal funding comes in close second. So I think it's relevant to mention what we're seeing with the sales tax revenue trends, you know, coming out of the pandemic. The slide here shows Texas sales tax revenue, and you can see it doesn't look so bad. So between this slide and the next, you'll see that the sales taxes is looking pretty relatively stable. So this next slide is going to have the state of California, and this is really showing you the difference between online sales tax generated versus brick and mortar sales tax generated. And I think we can all chalk that up to the changes in legislation at the end of 2019 relative to online sales and the collection of that sales tax, as well as the pandemic behavior. I know I was absolutely guilty of online shopping. There was probably a package being delivered to my door every day, whether it was paints and canvases for my kids, although for kids, not oil paint, do acrylic paint. I learned that the hard way, as well as groceries. So online sales became a real big deal during the pandemic, and I'm sure that's the same for many of you. But here you can see too that the brick and mortar is declining, and I think that is a result of the pandemic as well as the increase in online sales. So as we think about how we're going to spend these ARPA funds, let's not let the stable trends in sales tax fool us into thinking that it's truly stable next door. The brick and mortar is declining, mom and pop shops need your help. So that's something that you'll see here a lot that I'm going to talk about is prioritizing your funding and getting that triage money into your local community, perhaps before doing some of those bigger infrastructure type projects. So I know this is a lot to read. If any of you have had the pleasure of reading the interim final rule, 151-page document, it gets exhausting. But the main point here is that the Treasury is acknowledging the admin burden or the cost that's going to be associated with running the ARPA funding programs. And this cost is going to be associated with any type of federal funding. And like I said earlier, the large sums are overwhelming, especially for the smaller agencies that may not have the familiarity with how to administer and report that the Treasury sort of expects. So the primary focus here is really the importance of understanding those burdens and costs and being prepared and then maximizing that funding. So Indirect Cost 101, those of you that are not familiar, we want to step through this process, kind of end to end here so that you fully understand it and how it applies to the ARPA funding you're receiving, as well as any federal grant funding that you may currently have or are looking forward to applying for and being awarded. So the cost allocation plan, this is your first step. And this will help you achieve full transparency and awareness of your true costs. And you're going to hear me say that word a lot, true costs. So I want to point out here too, the cost allocation plan is going to incorporate costs from the central support departments. So that's like finance, HR, IT, facilities. They support all those receiving departments, which could be health and human services, police and fire, etc. So just to distinguish between those two, I think is important because a lot of time it's the central support departments that end up subsidizing the cost of programs for the receiving departments. So why a cost allocation plan or CAP? I'm going to use the acronym because the words get jumbled in my brain and my mouth. So why a CAP? It's so you can fully understand the true cost by department. It really gets down into the details so that you understand what it is costing you, from payroll to IT support. And a full cost allocation plan and central service cost allocation plan, both are going to enable you as leaders to manage your resources between departments, the demands between the departments, and then make good decisions with your budget and your strategic plan. And again, this is going to tie back to those ARPA funds. And when you know the true cost of your departments and your programs, you can make those funds work well for you. So the two types of cost allocation plans, there's the full CAP, and this gives you that insight to make those types of decisions. And you can see on the slide here, you can get reimbursement for services from non-general fund operations. So this may be just, inter department transfers that you may do, or just an acknowledgement in your financials. And then it allows you to calculate the indirect cost so that you can make those strategic budget decisions. Alternatively, there's the central service cost allocation plan. And this is what you would need to do to be enabled to do reimbursement for your federal and state grants. And so this is in compliance with the 2 CAFR 200 guidelines. And those are the guidelines set forth to guide you in preparing a central service cost allocation plan.
And Kim, just to add to that,
yeah.
So this is also would be known as the 2 CFR Part 200 plan, and the central service is what it's allocating out in your general fund, but it's following the uniform guidance that is required under the federal statute, the 2 CFR. So I just wanted to clarify that, typically speaking, it used to be known as the OMB plan, and it's still called that sometimes. So if someone's trying to differentiate, but really it's following the guidelines, so it's called the 2 CFR Part 200.
Yeah, thank you for that. And that was the little tidbit from Nikki, and that's what she really brings to the table here is those great details that support grant management and the intricacies of it all. So this is actually what you would need to accompany your indirect cost rate proposal in order to receive reimbursement for indirect cost associated with your federal grants. And the CAP is really the structure for reporting on your funding expenditures. You'll see just a little glimpse on down in the presentation here of where we break out expenditures. So that's just a little taste of that structure that you'll see. It's in a beautiful Excel spreadsheet, which I know you'll all appreciate. But that's why we do a CAP. It's the structure, it's kind of the foundation of determining what your true costs are. And, you know, it's also nice because of that structure, it provides for ease of reporting on your federally funded program expenditures. So not only is it going to be great for your federal grants, but also for this ARPA funding. So this separates out what examples of your direct costs and indirect costs are. Payroll is a great example of an indirect cost. It is incurred for a common purpose. So if you have a program, let's say that you're doing a program for Parks and Rec, you're building trails to improve, you know, perhaps it's part of community development. So you're building trails in a park and there's all those people working on those trails and it's costing a pretty penny, and that's your direct cost. But when the person in payroll is running direct deposits for all of those employees or all of those contractors working on that project, that's an indirect cost. So it's important that you understand things like that, and payroll is especially a great example. Human resources is another example. All of those departments play a role in running these programs, but we often don't recognize that. So again, this is really just your first step in achieving that full transparency and awareness of your true costs, and distinguishing between the central support departments and programs and then those receiving departments and programs. So here is a case study that I just think it's fascinating. So this is about body cam. It's a body cam grant. And I don't know who gets up in the morning and turns on the news and does not see some sort of body cam footage and drama surrounding it. But it's really a great program because it offers that transparency and protection for our local law enforcement. And I think we are all in agreement when it comes to transparency being very important for our communities. So in this example, after the caps and the indirect cost, we realized that the indirect cost was almost 5 times the cost of the direct cost. So that included things like, if you think police body cams, you've got IT storage costs to store all of the footage. You've got IT staff support to catalog and issue the recordings. The city clerk is there answering open records requests, because as soon as the community is aware that their law enforcement has police body cams, they're gonna ask for that kind of thing. The city attorney, because there's going to be need for representing the agency in litigation matters and things associated with any kind of body cam footage. So all of those additional costs came with, what we thought would be a nice body cam grant program. We've got all this funding, we're going to get the equipment, we're going to be good to go. But no, turns out it ended up costing this agency quite a bit more than they anticipated, and that was through those indirect costs. And it turns out, I know the numbers are a bit difficult to see here, but they were subsidizing the body cam grant by $2.6 million. So in other words, the grant funded almost $527,000 in those direct costs, but the true cost of the entire program was $3.14 million. So I just think this is a really compelling example of why it's important to be aware of those indirect costs and position yourself so that you may be reimbursed for those indirect costs. And Nikki, I know you worked directly on this cost allocation, and this is your work we're looking at right here. Do you want to tell us the story?
Sure. So years ago, when this became a really big push, not only from agencies for transparency, but then also from the public and the constituents of any given area wanting to have the security of the transparency. So this particular situation was an after the fact. So what I mean by that is the police department went off on their own, going after this grant, realizing, oh, we can have our body cams paid for, we can get what we need. And so they went to council with that interpretation. They were awarded the grant. Once they're awarded the grant, they now need to put it into effect. And what happened was they realized it was starting to burden the general fund. So they did a study on what it was really costing to support this on an annual basis. So with that being said, and why it's so critical to go through this process, and the hope is that you go through this process before you go after a grant, because there are grants that won't reimburse you for the indirect cost. For example, in this particular case, it was for the equipment and the initial implementation of the equipment. So they were not reimbursing for all of the support on an annual basis. So when you take this on, you have to then keep it going. So the agencies need to know and understand what that's going to cost. That doesn't necessarily mean you're not going to go after the grant. What this does is help to inform and allow you to make strategic decisions around different types of grants that you might go after. And then you can make a better choice of, one, if you want to go after it, and two, if you do, how are you going to fund it? So the idea is here, you could have, if you understood this impact to the general fund, you could go now put it to vote for the public. Ask them if they really want this. Do they want to increase their sales tax to cover the cost of the implementation and continuing maintenance? Or do we have to find other ways to support, or do we lower programs in other areas? Because this is a very important one. So it helps you to look at what it is it's going to cost you and how you're going to move forward. And I think this is very pertinent right now in terms of the ARPA funding and the CARES Act funding. As you're looking at programs where you're receiving this funding, it's critical that you understand the long-term effect of these programs. So right now, there's agencies that are feeling like, okay, we have money to support some of our shortfalls that we have from COVID, but then when you implement these programs and these new systems that you're purchasing with this funding, can you maintain it? And do you know what it's going to cost to maintain it? So it's a critical time in agencies right now to really get that perception, or that perspective, excuse me, that perspective of what is it costing us to not only implement, but maintain. And so this is the tool to help you determine those. Sam, back to you.
All right, so now we've talked about Indirect Cost 101 and given you kind of this overview of the cost allocation plan and certainly touched on indirect cost, but I'd like to go into some more details and how indirect cost ties back to the fiscal recovery funding like Nikki has just mentioned, as well as grant funding, and then get into some more details about negotiating that indirect cost rate so that you can receive the full reimbursement. So, you know, you are all striving to build smart and resilient communities, and one of the primary uses of funding allowable through the ARPA program is broadband infrastructure. You know, interestingly enough, though, it seems to be geared toward rural communities. So if you read the fine print, if it's for infrastructure that's not currently 25 megabits per second or above. So it really is targeting those rural communities. So that's just, you know, kind of a quick aside to stress how aware you'll need to be and understand what this funding can actually be used for. And, you know, to my point earlier about where to invest these funds, take a close look at your communities, because it could be that triage kind of situation where you want to pour some of this funding into your local economy and the ma and pa shops that make up your communities. And, you know, I don't want to paint this doom and gloom picture, because these fiscal recovery funds are really a great thing, but they are an administrative burden. And then there's also pressure on all of you and your elected officials to prioritize how these funds are used and to really shine, you know, to have that plaque next to the playground in the community, or have your constituents reach out to you through any kind of community outreach programs, because they now have the infrastructure and the internet to be able to connect with you in that way. And then, you know, you've already gone through one wave of funding through the CARES Act. So some of these funds can be used to keep up those programs you've already begun that you might have run out of funding for. So use lessons learned from that CARES Act funding wave and apply those lessons to the way you use these fiscal recovery funds. And to Nikki's point about sustainability, you know, careful planning and avoiding those programs that will have ongoing costs into the future that your budget without these funds would not support. And really it does stress throughout that interim final rule that the purpose of this is to bring the economy back and build it better. So indirect cost and grant funds is really similar. There are ARPA grant opportunities. There's $30.5 billion in Federal Transit Administration grants. And now this is over and above the fiscal recovery funds that you'll already be getting, but these are additional grant opportunities that are part of the ARPA program. Another $100 million in US EPA grants, and the list goes on. So there are great revenue opportunities here, and not only maximizing that funding that you're receiving from ARPA, but also your current grants and your current grant portfolio. And you can take it a step further on grants. And here's what goes back to that indirect cost recovery that Nikki was referring to. So if funding is still available on past grants, the indirect cost associated with those grants can be reimbursed back into your general fund. So if there is funding still available on those grants, you can apply an indirect cost rate and receive reimbursement. And in most cases, going back 2 years, you would have already, the program had ended as far as you're concerned, but we can open up those books and look back at that and inject your general fund with reimbursements. So like the police body cam example, that was $2.6 million after the fact that they got reimbursed. And you can do anything with those funds. They're restricted. Reimbursed indirect cost funds are unrestricted, so they go right back to your general fund. You can put it back toward the program if you want to. You can fill budget gaps. You can start up a new social program. So you can do anything with them. So I know it's exciting to get all of these ARPA funds, but I think while you're at it, it's definitely worth looking at those past federal grants and look at reimbursement opportunities there. And just further along those lines, this chart shows how much money is being left on the table, that $150 billion in unspent grants. And federal grant spending has grown in the last several years. So we went from $576 billion in 2014 to $749 billion in 2019. And it's estimated that 9 to 20% of allocated grant funding goes unspent. So if you do the math, that's 67 to $150 billion in money left on the table that you have to access from prior years. And this is from the Lincoln Land Institute survey that they did a couple of years ago. And I find it just fascinating. Nikki, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, this is something that I think is really important to understand when we think about indirect cost recovery. So often agencies are of the philosophy, which we'll go into a little bit more later, but of the philosophy of we don't want to take money away from the program. So what we can see here is that, on average, there's about $600 billion that are being spent directly on the program. So if everything stayed the same, that's what would be being spent. But as you can also see, is there's still $150 billion ready to capture that you could use for this indirect cost. So when we say indirect cost spent, you see that $180 billion. That's the average indirect cost rate that's applied to dollars spent on programs. So it's about the same as what's being unspent. So what you can see is that there is accessible dollars that wouldn't take any dollars away from what you're already doing. And the reason why these $150 billion, they're awarded. So the idea is they've been awarded to agencies, they just have gone unspent. So this is the market, and this is the area in which we can capture dollars for your agency that have otherwise been left on the table, that had been assumed to be already gone. And the reason for that is for whatever reason, you haven't been able to fully draw down on your award for resources or timing or whatever it might be. Agencies typically on all of their awards are not able to fully spend and draw down. So this opportunity in looking at your indirect cost rate and leveraging that to grab any available dollars within your grant portfolio is what we're really looking at, and where you have the opportunity to really recover dollars for your general fund to use as you see fit. So this to me, when you look at $150 billion, that's our accessible dollars that currently on an annual basis are not being touched. So, when you look at that from the perception of we don't want to take money away from the program, you're not in this case, or you're not in any case, but in this case, you have some you can still grab and continue to do exactly as you're doing now.
So we've been talking about indirect cost recovery and getting those funds back into your general fund. So you might be asking how. And that is through negotiating an indirect cost rate agreement. So this, and I'm going to call it a NICRA, this is established with your cognizant agency. The cognizant is the federal agency from which you're receiving the largest grant dollars. So you would negotiate this rate, and I don't know if you remember before, but when I was talking about the central service cost allocation plan, that's the type of cap you need along with an indirect cost rate proposal to negotiate with the cognizant. So you submit this, you negotiate, and then you receive rates per department, that indirect cost rate per department. So it's can be kind of a complicated process, but it's absolutely worth it because with no indirect cost reimbursement, you're only receiving direct costs for a grant program, like that police body cam example. You're subsidizing all of your central services at the department level, and honestly, you don't know how much it takes to how much it costs to take on a grant. So any future funding opportunities, you're a bit in the dark with how much it could truly cost you and how much you'd end up subsidizing. Many agencies use a 10% de minimis. And in most cases, true indirect cost exceeds the 10%. So agencies still could be missing out on more funding from grant programs. As you can see here, the average 30 to 40% for governments when you have a NICRA is it's pretty compelling and more than 10%. And the NICRA really closes that gap between admin caps and match requirements on grants. So you can fully maximize the admin cap on the award amount, the amount of the grant, instead of just the admin cap on the actual spend and direct costs. So the NICRA allows you to kind of take that a step further. And, you know, one thing I'd like to point out too is funders look really favorably on grant applicants with a NICRA. It's an indication that the applicant has gone through that cost allocation process and the indirect cost rate proposal process. And it shows that you have that full awareness of your true costs and therefore would manage that particular grant program in a good way. So, you know, with these average rates being 30 to 40% of every dollar, that's almost 225 billion of indirect costs to access annually. And that kind of ties back to the chart we saw before. So indirect cost mythbusters. So I know many of you are familiar with the cost allocation plan process. Most of you likely do it. I know counties have to do it. But there are some myths associated with the indirect cost component of that I'd like to go through here. So this is one that Nikki actually had just referred to. Funding will be directed away from the program to cover administrative costs. And this is a very common perspective. Every agency wants those dollars to go entirely to the grant program. But that assumes that indirect costs are optional, which they are not. Payroll is vital. IT is vital. So if you're not acknowledging these indirect costs, then your general fund is subsidizing them. So I want to make sure that through grant funding, through ARPA funding, that you don't end up in a situation where your general fund really suffers because it's subsidizing the cost to run these programs. So myth number 2, this is already covered through our recent allocation plan. So like I was saying, the cost allocation plan is a common practice. Counties have to do them. User fee studies is something that a lot of cost allocation plans set out to achieve so that you have good insight into what your user fees are and what they might need to be. But with the 2CAF for Part 200 cost allocation plan, that central services cost allocation plan, that's taking it another step where you can then negotiate that rate, apply it to your grant portfolio, and receive reimbursement. By simply performing a full cost allocation plan, you're not actually achieving that next step, and you might as well.
And Kim, if I can add to that.
Yeah.
So many agencies go through the process of doing a cost allocation plan, as Kim mentioned, for budgeting purposes. And you might even do a 2 CFR cost plan. The idea is that some agencies know, like maybe there's one program that has required them to do it, so they've done it for the sake of that program. They haven't necessarily negotiated it or gone through the process of calculating the indirect. So what is really important to take away from this conversation is that your cost allocation plan is that 30,000-foot view of your organization. It looks at all of your support to all programs, regardless of whether it is a grant, a public funded program, or a fee, whatever that is. It gives you that insight. But you have to take it to the next step of calculating your indirect cost rates by service levels like transportation, housing, health and human services, those types of areas that you're performing programs on. You have to then calculate the rate using your cost allocation plan. So it's a component of it. And then negotiating so you can then apply it to these grants. So there are steps that follow that cost allocation plan, and they are not covered by the calculation through the cost allocation plan. You have to take it a step further.
Thanks, Nikki. With myth number 4, you must apply the negotiated indirect cost rates across all departments. Not true. You don't have to. You can choose where to apply it. It might be for a specific grant, or it might be just so that you have that awareness. There's certainly political sensitivities here. So if you obtain a negotiated indirect cost rate, you are not required to apply it. You can do what you will with it. You know, hopefully you can apply it as much as possible, but it's absolutely not required.
Yeah, and again, to add to that as well. So oftentimes people think if you go through this process that you'll be required to apply it across the board. And I think that thought process comes from if an agency does a user fee study and they determine that rates they're charging to the public are high, they are required to lower them. So sometimes they're apprehensive to go through the process because they don't want to necessarily change their fees if they don't have to. So the idea behind that is that's specific to charging more than what you're actually incurring. So as a local government, as a public sector agency, you can't do that. You can't charge more than. But the idea here is if we calculate the rate as it stands, you can charge anywhere below that. So you can choose to charge nothing to a program, or you can choose to charge half of it. But your backup and justification is your negotiated rate that's at the actual level of cost. And then anywhere below it, it's a strategic decision or a policy decision on the agency's part on how you pick and choose where you charge that. So just to clearly explain that when you are looking at this, this is a tool for you to understand for sustainability purposes what it's costing you for everything that you're doing. But you do get to determine you can apply it in one place and not in another. And that's absolutely up to you as a policy decision.
Great. And, you know, I realized we skipped over myth 3. So I want to go back to that because I think that is an important one to point out. My current CAP service provider already does this for us, this meaning negotiating the indirect cost rate and applying it to the grant portfolio. So a lot of cost allocation plan vendors will do the cost allocation plan. They will even take that extra step to negotiate the rate. but they don't go back and apply it to your grant portfolio going back 2 years. So I want to make sure that you're all aware of that. We've run into some situations where a lot of the cost allocation plan vendors claim to do this, but they stop short. So it's important that you realize that, and that you do take that extra step to look back 2 years through your grant portfolio, applying those rates, and submitting drawdown reimbursement requests from your funders. And skipping to myth 5. We're already getting ARPA funding. Why would we bother with this unknown smaller revenue from grants? You know, I can see the dollar signs in all of our eyes with the ARPA funding that's coming out. But regardless of how much you're getting, sustainability is key. And I know that I keep saying this over and over again, but just having that awareness around your funding, how much it's costing you, that will enable you to keep these funds sustainable and going into the future, and your programs working into the future. It's really crucial to plan ahead here, regardless of how much you're getting. You know, I know we were all kind of sitting back and waiting for the interim final rule to come out because we didn't know how we were going to spend these funds or how we could spend these funds, but there's plenty of planning we can be doing right now, which would be, you know, making sure we have an up-to-date cost allocation plan, negotiating those indirect cost rates, and having just in general that awareness of your true costs. So now that we've gone through these myths, Nikki, in your police body cam story, did you encounter some of these myths?
Yes, very much so. Kind of back to where I was talking about the body cams, it's one thing to covered through a grant. So implementation, if the grant goes so far as implementation and equipment or systems, again, this is looking at a annual or maybe, you know, one, maybe possibly 2-year cycle. But what it does not take into account is future replacement, future maintenance, future upgrades, future just continuing maintenance of any type of system or program that exists. So what is really important is understanding that not only you know what it's going to cost to maintain moving forward or how you're going to upgrade or replace, but the existing. Get every dollar possible from the ARPA funding that you can, and do that through negotiating your indirect cost rate. But then you are set for future planning if you continue to do the indirect cost rate, so you can make sure that you're looking at what is it going to cost to support and maintain this long term, so that you're not in a position where the ARPA funding runs out and you now have this program you have implemented and that you have to continue being sustainable and you don't know where the funding is going to come from. So although our process is we're also going to look back 2 years to obtain any available funding to maximize your opportunities, it's also setting you up and setting the foundation for looking forward on maintenance of these fundings. So I know it's our goal as these organizations are moving forward to continue to improve and thrive in how they produce programs for their constituents and how they look at things. So just like we were not prepared for COVID because no one knew that this could possibly happen or what the impact was going to be. And as we're starting to come out of that and really getting a better understanding of the impact, we are getting some assistance with the ARPA funding, but that is only a short-term process. So understanding, let's pack our general fund with reimbursement that's allowable to you as much as possible so you can use the ARPA funding for more and other things, and then also setting yourself up for success in the future for how do you look at the programs you've now implemented using this funding, and when this funding runs out, what are you going to do? So it's more critical than ever that this is done, because, you know, I've heard, I've gone through a process with some agencies. You know, this happens with disaster funding. So a lot of times agencies, I know of a state that has actually years ago during a disaster had opted to, you know, for public purposes, we're not going to take any indirect. We're going to put it all to the program, because that was their impression, and they were trying to do a good thing. And what ended up happening, and this was like 15 years ago, they're still trying to pay back the deficit of the indirect cost for those programs, because it was so huge what the impact of that was by not taking the indirect, which was allowable to them, especially in disaster funding. They will fully reimburse an indirect, and they didn't, because they didn't want the public to think that they were taking away from the program. So the understanding that that is not the case, and knowing that these functions of what is thrown in the quote unquote indirect bucket are actually very important costs that are critical to running any program. You know, as Kim mentioned, the payroll, the IT, you know, we can't do our jobs without a computer. If we're not getting paid, no one's doing their job. All of those things, it's not an optional cost. So it is a cost of doing the program. So it's about helping people to understand and grow with their understanding of indirect costs and the aspect of it. So wherever possible, take the steps that put you in line to be successful, not only looking back and maximizing those dollars, but looking forward and making sure you can be sustainable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can't get over the body cam example, because it is such a good example. And I know you have many more, like you said, with the disaster funding, where this happens over and over again. So I know that this is a bit complicated, but the cost allocation plus the grants management must be the standard. So, you know, transparency is such an important thing, like we've mentioned on the call today, like you're all living every day, being transparent to your communities. So when it comes to leaving money on the table, that results in a tax increase, possibly, or it results in a situation like Nikki just mentioned, through the disaster recovery funding, where they're still paying that off. So just remember that if you can maximize this funding and sustain the funding and not leave any funds on the table, you are doing the best you can possibly do for your community. And I know this looks really complicated, but of course you can try this at home. That was just my humor coming through a little bit. But many of you already go through this CAP process, as we've mentioned, but are you also leveraging those indirect costs for reimbursement? And I think that's where there's really the opportunity here to not only have an understanding of your true costs when it comes to ARPA funding, other federal grant funding, but also leveraging that indirect cost for reimbursement. And I think the key takeaways from this particular slide is acknowledging how this process can be so complicated. Going back to that first quote from the interim final rule, the Department of the Treasury's expectations that agencies understand the administrative burden and assume that you know what to do and how to do it. So really taking the time to prepare now is absolutely critical. So our call to action here, first, update your cost allocation plan if you haven't already. Knowledge is power. This is going to give you that insight into your true costs so that you know what any kind of programs you're going to do with the ARPA funding and any existing federal grant programs you may have. You know that true cost. This is going to enable decisions for budgeting, for future grants, and for program sustainability. Next, negotiate that indirect cost rate, supplement this new federal funding with the reimbursed revenue from past funding. And that will truly help you maximize, remain sustainable, and avoid big gaps in your general fund revenue. The next one is prioritize funding. So you might need to inject those funds into the local community first to keep your small businesses afloat, but then you can look to those infrastructure projects, etc. Appoint a committee or organize a task force. This really helps to set the foundation and the stage of making your federal funding programs successful. And transparency and accountability to the community can also be achieved with appointing a task force. And this council would be tasked with aggregating and augmenting existing recovery plans, perhaps left over from CARES Act funding. Establishing goals and priorities, recommending investments, tracking results. Again, it goes back to being transparent and sharing with your community what your plans are, or even involve your community in planning. And just a side note, if you haven't already, you can actually subscribe to the U.S. Department of the Treasury for important updates related to the American Plan Rescue Act, or Rescue Plan Act. I just put my email address in, subscribed, and now I receive updates. Although I have to say I haven't received any updates since the interim final rule was published, but you know, just a side note there so that you can stay on top of it. And also these resources, National League of Cities, ICMA, GFOA, and then the interim final rule itself are all great resources to get out and look at for frequently asked questions. And then, of course, the interim final rule for all of the regulations surrounding this funding. So with that, I'd like to open it up for questions. And I actually have a question for you too. And we put this in the chat. Again, it's in the live event Q&A in the published section. So after going through all of this, what are you seeing as your biggest challenge in managing or spending ARPA funds? And I'd just love to get some feedback from the audience here on that question, as well as what your plans are with spending your ARPA funding. And if for whatever reason you're not able to see the live event Q&A or you don't have an opportunity to reply to it, feel free to put any answers or other questions you have in the chat. I know my team's live event Q&A was a little wonky earlier. Not everyone at once. Does that mean that I just answered every question you could possibly have? And just to point out again, there's a 20-second delay. So we'll give it a few more seconds here. All right. Well, I want to thank you all very much for your time today. I hope this was informative. With this new partnership with eCivis, we offer current and future clients cost allocation plan and indirect cost recovery services. It's been an absolute pleasure working with Nikki, and I think we are a great match, HDL and eCivis, and we look forward to continuing to serve all of our agency clients. And if you have any additional questions at all, please reach out to myself. I'll put my email address in the chat so that you have that. And I hope you can continue with a great day. Thank you so much.